Welcome back to Metropole TV. This is The Smart Investor. My name is Ali Khan Sachu, and thanks for joining us after the break. In the studio, I've got somebody I've been following for years and years, somebody I use for my inside knowledge about the Horn of Africa, Rashid, Abdi. Rashid, thank you very much for making the time today.
Thank you very much, Ali.
You were with the International Crisis Group. You've now gone independent, I believe.
Yes, until fairly recently, I was the Horn of Africa Project Director for the International Crisis Group. So I basically kept an eye on what was happening in the region. I have since stepped out of that role, but I'm now an independent consultant, working for essentially various businesses as well as governments.
Rashid, let's start off with what's been unfolding in front of our eyes in Khartoum and in all the other cities in Sudan. I remember watching it and feeling it could have been my wife, my children in those streets. It had a sort of atmosphere, a zeitgeist I can't describe. And then suddenly they were all wiped off the street. We're now in a situation where it looks the military, the reactionary forces are going to try and do an Al-Sisi or something like that. What's going on, and who's got irons in the fire, and how do you read the situation?
I think there's no doubt that at the moment the crisis in Sudan has the potential to get even worse than it was before. And I think if you were in Sudan and saw the huge groundswell of opposition to the regime of Bashir, and you saw how actually for the first time this was a message that galvanized the entire country. People came all the way from Darfur.
Yes, I saw buses.
Exactly. People came from Blue Nile, from Kordofan, everywhere. Khartoum's, the protest sitting in Khartoum, was a microcosm of the entire nation. It was a message that galvanized. And we saw how even across the region in Africa, people, for the first time said, this is a people's power with a difference. It wasn't divisive, it was ecumenical, people came from all walks of life, a cross-section of professions. It was one of the most well-organized, non-violent protest movement anywhere. And for a military, which promised everyone that they wanted to hand over to civilian government, go out and in hours, machine gun and kill hundreds of people, throw their bodies into the Nile, I think was inconceivable and was extremely shocking to everyone.
When you say the military,
Yes.
Is it a monolithic military? I mean, was there a chain of command under Bashir and it remains, or a lot is made of this gentleman Hemeti who went on like a tour of all the region. I saw him with the MBZ and everybody.
Yeah.
Are they operating together? Is it coordinated, or are they different factions within the military as well?
I think this is a good question. The Sudanese military was never monolithic, and I think this is a function of a dictatorship. Bashir was quite adept at really increasing the number of security apparatuses. And this was a strategy on his part, so that he could basically play one off against the other. And over the years, he has depended on this unit, which is called the Rapid Support Forces,
This is
RSF.
Yes.
It is roughly, is estimated to be in around 20 or 30,000.
And these are the folks who went into Darfur.
Exactly. This was the originally the RAMP, the core was actually a militia group that operated, pro-government militia, drawn from a tribe called the Rizeigat, which operated in the Darfur. And because they were very good, they knew the terrain extremely well, and they also had access to ground. This was a local conflict in which they were invested in. So they were very ferocious and they were quite effective in the battlefield. And Bashir, actually what he did was basically co-opted this militia, rehatted them, made them into a professional sort of paramilitary force, calling it Rapid Support Forces. And over the years, it has served Bashir very well. In every episode of uprising, he has actually used and deployed the RSF. And I think increasingly, the man who was in charge, the commander, Hemeti, became also a problematic figure, but somebody who was very much closely aligned to Bashir, and also somebody who had wanted a prize back. He was coming to Khartoum, basically said, look, I have served you all these years. Now that Bashir is out of the picture, I need to be very much on the table. And I don't want just to be a marginal figure. I want to be very central. I want to be driving. And I think that's where you see the divisions between Hemeti, the paramilitary force commander, who did not even have a professional military training. He never went through staff college. Being seen by the other professional military men like Burhan as basically an interloper, so somebody they needed to sideline. So the crisis in Sudan is not just the fact that you have a military that doesn't want to hand over power, but a dangerously divided military which can actually quickly turn its guns on one another.
Rashid, I've been following the Hong Kong protests as well. Right. And, I was thinking to myself this morning, what's the difference? Because they had millions of people in the streets in Khartoum.
Yes.
They had millions in Hong Kong.
Yep.
And Hong Kong faced down Xi Jinping because he looked at it and he said, I can't have this go on anymore.
Exactly.
It's on a live feed.
Yeah.
It's going to be so embarrassing.
Yeah.
Is it because Sudan is a third world country that is not on our screens 24/7 that the military could behave in this manner?
I think that explains it, but I think more the fact is that you have a military that has always instinctively resorts to violence whenever confronted by opposition. This is a military that has also been very adept, and this is something which I don't think many people know. The Sudanese military was not only a fighting machine.
It was what?
It was also an instrument of peacemaking. So it was involved in peace processes from the Sudanese peace talks. Military men were actually in the front line of making peace with rebel groups. And remember, Sudan was a country in which actually even at one point had 20 or 30 insurgencies, active insurgencies
within the
country.
So not just South Sudan.
Not just South Sudan. You have problem in Darfur, you have problem in Blue Nile, you have problem in Kordofan, you have problem in Eastern Sudan. At any one time there was multiple conflicts going on. So the army was deployed, and when they couldn't win the conflict by military conquest, they had to resort to peace processes. So there were multiple peace processes in which the Sudanese military was involved. Then there was the other bigger picture, national peace process, which they called the National Dialogue. For 20 years, the National Dialogue produced no results whatsoever. It was simply what people will call the attrition option, in which the military basically engaged in these processes.
Is that their strategy of attrition right now?
Exactly.
You think?
This is a classic military strategy. In a difficult situation, if you can draw in the enemy into a battle of attrition in which you stand the advantage of winning, then do it. This is a classic military strategy which has been deployed. And in a way, you can see a process in which basically politics became militarized. Even the rhetoric of Bashir on the peace process clearly betrays that militarization of politics. The National Dialogue, is the people who are political parties are called the internal front.
Rashid, let me now take it to, so many articles I've read. Russia has an iron in the fire. Sudan has been a long time a loose partner with Russia. You've got the Gulf countries. I mean, the visits that both the military leaders made was toward the Gulf, Al-Sisi, MBZ, MBS, right? And then they came down to Abdi and Afwerki's. So it seems to me this is a proxy situation. Everyone's got some equity in the game. Is that correct?
That is correct. And I think, you can, generally the entire Horn of Africa has today become one of the most important real estates in the whole world.
Why is that?
This is partly because traditionally, even historically, this was a very important region because it overlooks the Gulf of Aden, an important waterway in which 2/3 of world commercial shipping and oil supplies pass through.
So you're talking Gulf of Aden, then
Gulf
up
of
to
Aden,
Strait of
the Red
Hormuz.
Sea. Exactly.
Yes. Okay.
So this is anybody who had classic geopolitics was always about maintaining influence over this territory. And countries, from the United States, from Russia, China have always competed over one another. Now there are middle powers who have emerged and who want a stake in the game.
UAE, Saudi Arabia.
Saudi Arabia. These are middle powers, quite ambitious. They want to build their military footprints in the Red Sea, but also they are locked up, they are engaged in a conflict, an active conflict in Yemen. And also there is one coming up, there is one looming, which is Iran.
Yes.
And these have all created, I think, a situation in which these countries need to get allies. Remember, Sudan is already militarily engaged in Yemen. And Ethiopia, part of the strategy of why these Arab countries are interested in Ethiopia is the biggest military power in the region. If you get in a conflict situation, you can look up to Ethiopia for help. And this is the strategy. Arabs are saying, if we enter into a conflict with Iran tomorrow and we need boots on the ground, who can we look for? And so they are looking across.
So this is cannon fodder.
Yeah, they are looking across the pond and saying, military powers are Eritrea, Ethiopia. This is part of the strategy. I'm not saying it's the only strategy, but it is part of the calculations of these Arab powers, that these major countries with quite big militaries and also with a lot of combat experience can be of use and utility. But I think coming to the Sudan in particular, Sudan straddles a very important fault line. It is basically a sub-Saharan African state, but also an Arab state. It is Islam, Christianity, so it is a fault line for all these, important identities. And that is why I think having an influence has always been of a strategic interest to these Arab powers. Bashir was quite adept at really manipulating and playing one off against the other. But I think Bashir also became difficult to control, but as far as the Arabs are concerned. Towards the tail end of his regime, he actually pivoted towards Turkey and promised to build Sawakin port, for example.
That's right, yes.
Yeah.
He gave them the port.
There was a deal that was being worked out. And also he flew to Russia and said, we are forging a strategic military relations, and he bought new fighter jets from Russia. So all of a sudden, I think everybody was at a loss. In other words, Bashir could not be figured out by the Arabs. So now they are looking for a type who is quite dependable, somebody who is quite dependable, and that is why they have seen the TMC, the Transitional Military Council, or people in the Transitional Military Council as probably more dependable allies. And this explains why the Saudis and the Emiratis have put their stakes in the TMC. I don't think anybody believes the idea that TMC is a weapon against Islamists. It is a much more complicated picture than that. I think the main reason, the driver really is military. They want to maintain the Sudanese troops in Yemen, but also to draw in more of Sudan into their potential conflicts in the future.
The Prime Minister of Ethiopia, who I found a very mercurial personality, he arrived on the scene, he kind of changed the language, he sent a love letter to Isaiah Afwerki, and I think Afwerki's never had a love letter from anybody, I imagine. There was all this thawing of relationships, whirlwind tours. He's now the interlocutor, but they kind of disrespected him because they arrested a couple of people who'd gone to see him. Yeah. Let's move from Sudan. Let's go to Ethiopia, fastest growing African country last decade. A lot of issues about how that growth was achieved. He has renegotiated his loans already with the Chinese, whereas other African countries haven't done that. But on the ground, people are telling me, look, there's a lot of ethnic tension which is not coming out. Tell me what's happening in what is such an anchor state. You've just told me militarily the strongest one. What's happening there?
I think 2 years down the line, the situation in Ethiopia is difficult.
Still?
The situation still remains difficult. Prime Minister Abdi, I think, has made some good progress on some important fronts. I think we are beginning to see, important debates on the structure of the economy, on, the fundamental workings of the old developmental states. We have seen him walk back from some of the, very, I think, problematic projects and, extravagant, infrastructure projects. I think he's much more prudent economically. belongs to
Well,
a much
he's
more
now opening up the telecom
Exactly.
sector. That was something that was never considered
yes.
by any predecessor.
Exactly. His instinct is neoliberal.
It is,
It is. But I think the difficulty is that this is also a country that has had a long history with very state-driven economics. The whole developmental state was actually a state-driven infrastructure boom. And now that that has led to a bust, in terms of
Cash.
Exactly, the payments, it has become difficult. It's unsustainable. This country, will be in crisis for the next few years economically because it's run out of completely foreign
Cash.
reserve.
Yes.
Its economy has slowed down. Conflict also has had a direct impact actually on foreign investment.
Because I was wondering about that,
Yes.
and I was wondering about GDP, because they always come
Yeah.
up with these really big
Yeah.
numbers,
Yes.
right? It's like
Yes.
Tanzania. Well, Tanzania now,
Yeah.
they've had to halve the number. But,
Yes.
historically, they've always said 8, 10%,
Yes.
come what may. Is that the reality?
I think you have to give them credit. The Ethiopians actually never sex up figures.
Yes.
They are very good at actually, so the data which is produced on statistics is actually very good, very reliable. And they paint a very bleak picture. Foreign direct investment is slowing down. And remember, the areas which are also having a lot of conflict problems, inter-ethnic conflicts, are also the breadbaskets, are also the drivers. This is the lush
is that right?
green highlands. Exactly. This is where the coffee is grown. This is the hub of the tourism industry. So the increasing or the escalating ethnic tensions and violence has actually had a direct impact on economic activities. It is dumping down, it is slowed down economic, and also some of the investment, especially plantations have been directly hit.
And gone wrong, right?
Exactly.
There's been farm invasions and...
not farm invasions, I think,
But
tensions have risen. So we shouldn't, I think, be very pessimistic about Ethiopia. This is a country with huge potential, with very powerful friends globally, internationally, people who... Ethiopia is too big to fail. And I think that is why you are beginning to see many actors come along and say, how can we fix things? And I think Abiy can rely on it. He's the only, I think, guy who can rely very comfortably with China, with Americans and everyone else without people becoming upset about it. And so I think while the country faces huge difficulties, and ethnic conflict is one you have mentioned, Abiy, I think, has failed to get on top of the ethnic tensions. I think, also is caught in a very difficult place. If he moves too robustly against it, he probably also will be seen as undermining his support base. And that explains also why I think, some of his actions in Oromia, for example, have not, been effective, because Oromia is his home province. Yet, the violence and, the tensions are still very palpable.
Would he win an election if he stood and it was a fair and square one?
Possibly.
Because they're talking about that now.
They are talking about that, but I think clearly, and this is an important area, Ethiopia has been in such big mess that it will take time to fix it. And I think you need to be gradual, you need to be phased, you need to have sequences. You can't just,
There's no silver bullet.
You can't fix Ethiopia overnight. And I think the danger is that if you move these
very fast... But
very
hasn't he
fast,
set expectations that he
too
can
high.
fix it quick?
And I think this is part of the problem. He moved very fast. And I think this was a strategy on his part. Really, he wanted to move very fast to basically...
To confuse everybody.
Yeah. But now he's stuck in a situation in which he needs to now move strategically. And I think we haven't seen him do that. This is a prime minister...
Do you think he has the capacity to do that?
He has the capacity, but so far this is a prime minister who loves doing his own thing, who is suspicious of big bureaucracies and institutions, who loves doing it, who goes alone. And I think that's a huge risky venture. You need to build institutionalized reform. You need to gain the confidence of bureaucracies, because ultimately you will rely on them to really, fix the state.
You can't do it yourself.
You can't alienate them. And that, I think, is the dilemma which Abiy faces. But I think overall, this is a country on a positive trajectory.
You're bullish?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Let's go to Somalia. There's been a lot of debate. There's been a lot of argument, contestation. between ourselves and our brothers across the border. You know, I was thinking to myself when I was looking at it geoeconomically, you know, if Somalia starts to do well, surely it's going to have a very strong pull effect and a positive effect for us. But why is there all this contest? What's going on?
I think, you know, this is a good point you raised. You know, this is a country which, if can only have a sustainable period of peace, will be actually the engine and the driver of economic, you know, transformation in the Horn. It has a very huge entrepreneurial people. Very. It has, you know, it's able to draw on the expertise of its huge diaspora, who are increasingly bringing expertise and skills and money back home. Kenya, you know, has benefited enormously, you know, from that Somali, you know, expertise and investment. And so, in a way, Kenya and Somalia have been the most, although it hasn't been very visible, these two countries are actually much more economically integrated than any other country, than any other two countries in the region.
You think about the communities that are existing.
Exactly. And then you also have, I think, from Kenya's perspective, you have a huge soft power capital in the sense that you have a huge population of your own, you know, your own citizens who are also speakers of Somali, who have, you know, family across. These are all, I think, elements of potential success and cooperation. Unfortunately, you know, we have seen how they have also been drivers of conflict and, you know, animosity and hostilities. And remember also, Al-Shabaab have been, you know, driving a wedge and constantly trying to I think, disrupt that process of integration and harmony and friendship. And I would think that, look at the problem of the maritime and oil and gas
So
dispute.
give us your perspective on that problem.
Exactly. This, you know, it remains, I think, unknown, the exact quantity of oil and gas in this territory.
There's a lot.
There is a lot.
I know.
Yeah. So this is a huge piece of economic gain for the two countries.
Yes.
Now, people who are well versed in this kind of, you know, issues, especially in the Gulf of Guinea, but also in the problem in the Bakassi Peninsula in particular, tell you it's very difficult for a maritime border dispute where oil and gas lies to be properly demarcated. Oil usually is trapped in a barrel kind of a shell. So you cannot classically demarcate it like a border piece of territory. So what happens if you drill a tank, that shell from one side, the oil is drained towards that side.
Yes.
So even geologically, it makes sense for these two countries to cooperate on really, like you know, Nigeria and Cameroon. What they have done is basically said, instead of us fighting and constantly haggling over who is right and who is wrong over this piece of territory, why don't we have a co-management, co-administration, and share the resources?
Is that your recommendation?
And this, I think, is my solution, because look at it. Even if the court tomorrow decided that, you know, Kenya is wrong and Somalia is right, that is not going to resolve problem, because it's an unbinding you know, verdict. Kenya will simply say, no, we can't recognize it. Then Kenya goes ahead and builds oil rigs. Al-Shabaab and other forces, even the Somali Navy, will probably attack it and say that this is our territory.
So it can't be resolved.
It can be resolved militarily. It can be resolved through the courts. This is something that can only be resolved through negotiations. Somalis, you know, have driven a hard bargain and say, you know, we need to be vindicated by the court before we enter into a position of, before we enter into dialogue. Strong, you know, feeling strong and feeling we are vindicated. The Kenyans say, no, you know, this is our territory. They produce, you know, colonial records and so on and so forth. So I think if we go down the route of, you know, who is right and who is wrong, we are going to be blindsided. And so the best course, and I think the best strategy, is for a sober and, you know, rational calculation on both sides to say, let's come together and task people like Ali and, you know, others into how really to divide the revenue and resources. What you need is actually to disengage the politics and to simply give greater latitude and rein to actually economists and, you know, geologists to try to drive this resolution.
Rashid Abdi, it's been a fascinating discussion today. We would like to invite you back so we can then look through all these other countries we've missed out, Eritrea, so many others which have a key role. But thank you very much for making time for us.
Appreciate it.
This was Metropole TV, the first 24-hour business news channel here in East Africa. This was The Smart Investor. My name is Ali Khan Sachu, and my guest today was Rashid Abdi.